called affluenza, a fancy term for being the product of dysfunctional parents who did not teach right from wrong. It is also being used as a defense for Ethan Couch, who got 10 years in a cushy California rehab center instead of prison for the killing of 4 people in a drunk driving accident. He then skipped town, escaping to Mexico, where he now says he will return to face the music. Joining us to discuss the affluenza phenomenon are criminal justice professor at Seton Hall University, John Patakis, also Mike Vini, who is an expert on mental health, and Tom Gagliano, life mentor, author, speaker as well. And via Skype, long-term defense attorney Scott Palmer is joining us as well. Mr. Palmer and everybody else, welcome. This is a crazy case. I mean, is this part of a generational thing? I know when kids go and participate in an event today, they get a participation award. It doesn't seem, everything seems to be upside down. I may be sounding old, but...
Well, let me say this based on, I worked in probation for 29 years. I worked with a number of different judges or whatever. Usually there are several things that take place that a judge should evaluate before sentencing. One is the seriousness of the crime. 4 people were killed.
9 injured.
And 9 injured, right. Second, any prior incidents. The kid had some prior contact with law enforcement. Number 3, what's the social background of the family? And the last is victim input. Now, if the judge took all that into consideration, it's unbelievable how she gave that kind of sentence, okay? In addition to what you said, she put him on 10 years probation, right. Okay? So, I mean, that was completely, an incomplete sentence or whatever for somebody with that behavior.
Tom, let's boil this down. It sounds like a spoiled kid.
Well, first, affluenza is a ridiculous diagnosis. Overindulging at children is terrible. It doesn't teach them coping mechanisms. It fuels the fire. But the real fire is caused by negative childhood messages. If a child grows up with messaging that they're not important, they're not lovable, they're not valued, they're going to grow up with negative core beliefs. And if they grow up with negative core beliefs, they're going to act that out someday with addiction, bullying, domestic violence are acted in, with depression, isolation. So all of this stuff really stems from the belief that the child has that I'm not important. Overindulging, yeah, doesn't help. But you know what? Whether you're in a rich family or poor family, whatever the color of your skin is, whatever your religion is, if you have negative core beliefs, you're going to act them out in destructive ways.
Well, there must be a happy medium, and we'll go to you, Mike.
Absolutely.
There must be a happy medium between teaching your kid that there are boundaries and the world is not a bed of roses and you get more no's than yeses in your life, and also building that child up. I mean, isn't it just parenting?
Absolutely. I'm a mental health advocate, and in my own experience with mental health challenges, I've learned that my upbringing has caused a lot of issues for me, and anyone who struggles with mental health challenges, you have to look at their upbringing.
So you analyzed yourself?
I analyzed myself and have therapy too. However, at the same time, you can't use your issues as an excuse for behavior. And if this child can get away with it here, this is going to be a problem around the country for other cases. If kids just decide to say, hey, my parents didn't raise me right, so that's why I acted out and committed a crime. So I think it's really, really important to address your mental health issues and your upbringing and look at the messages that you were given. At the same time, they cannot be an excuse for behavior.
Scott Palmer, you're an attorney. This is very reminiscent, at least in my mind, of the insanity defense, which we all scoffed about years ago. And now this new word, affluenza. I mean, how would you have handled this case? Was it handled properly in your mind?
Well, these lawyers were very creative. They hired a great psychologist, a creative psychologist who coined this term, and I don't think he realized what he was saying was going to have the effect that it did. Clearly, he was trying to get the judge to see the point, which is that this kid had so much privilege, and they clearly sold the judge. I mean, I've never seen the defense happen before. It's never been floated, and it worked. It'll never happen again. It'll never darken the court's doors again because of the outrage and the disgust that everyone has, including your guest there on the show, that the judge went for it. I mean, we weren't part of the hearing. It was a 3-day hearing that was closed to the public, and she heard a lot of things, but she eventually gave him what she thought was the correct punishment, which is a rehab and 10 years probation, which would have ended, by the way, in April when he turns 19 if they don't transfer him to adult court, which we all think is going to happen relatively soon.
Now, Scott, I happen to disagree with you. I think many people will. If this has been used before once successfully, it's going to be used again somewhere down the line, and using this case to reference it.
Sure. I mean, you could certainly try it, but I think that the outrage that has been has made this case is not going. It's not. The defense is almost hollow now because you cannot use what is worked once.
But the judge went for it. The judge went for it, and it worked.
I think it's an aberration. I don't think any other judge would ever go for this again.
All right, let's go back to Mr. Patakis, because you see this, you've been around the criminal justice system for a very long time.
Well, it worked up until now, okay, but I think there's a good chance when it goes back for the transfer hearing next week that it's moved to the adult court. So as far as a precedent, yes, somebody could use it again, but chances are it may not hold up. If you recall many years ago, did you ever hear the Twinkie defense?
Yes.
In California?
Yes.
The guy overdosed on Twinkies or whatever.
Too much sugar in his system and so on.
So was that ever used again?
Well, the insanity defense, we scoffed at it 25, 30 years ago.
Yeah. Well, the other option the judge had was, even though that psychologist was a reputable psychologist, she could have asked for another independent psychiatric or psychological evaluation. All right. So really, I think a lot of it just falls upon the judge. If she looked at all the criteria that we just talked about, it's inconceivable how she could have made that decision.
Let's bounce over to Mike Vini, because you're a mental health expert. Is this real?
That's a really, really good question. It's a tough question because, again, like I said before, people have their upbringing. But if you think about the other cases in the country with shootings, a 13-year-old shoots someone, they can't blame their parents for their upbringing at that point. At that point, it's a crime that they committed. So that's where I think this case is a little bit different, that we're not addressing the amount of people that were killed and hurt. So I do think this is different, but I do think you have to look at both things, the upbringing, and you have to address that at the same time. And that's a big discussion in this country because so many kids are living with parents that are, what do they call them, helicopter parents, that take care of too many things, parents that show up at the college, when the kid gets
with
a
the
bad
interview,
grade.
and
this is really creating a whole generation that is dependent on parents.
Well, Tom, these millennials, and I don't want to harp on any particular generation, but it seems to me that they have never heard the word no in their lives. And when they hear a no, they're almost insulted. And then we get into microaggressions. We get into, I don't understand that. Explain that to me.
Well, no to many kids means ask me again. That's not what no means. Right. So we have a situation where there are a lot of parents rushing in too quick. Kids are not learning how to get out of their own messes. And they're going to grow up without coping mechanisms. And who are they going to be mad at? The parent that rushed in. Because they're not going to have the self-esteem to deal with life on life's terms.
Now let's look at the parents for a second. These are parents generally that came of age in the 70s, okay? Now, was that the decade where parenting changed for a lot of?
Parents generally do one or two things. They either parent exactly the way they were parented, or they go too far the other way. You'll see very disciplined parents become too permissive with their children. Right. You'll see very permissive parents become they'll go the other way. Generally, if they don't go somewhere to learn how to parent, how to teach communication tools, how to give their children the messaging that they're important, how to go to your child and say, hey, what's going on with you? I care about how you feel right now. If they're not giving those tools, what are they going to do? They can only go by what they learned.
Now, Scott Palmer, have you come in contact with parents who have this particular situation in which their child is in trouble and the child just can't cope and the parent is perplexed about what to do?
Sure. I mean, all the time I get clients from different backgrounds, economic backgrounds, but I think the key in this case is that this child had rich parents that were divorced in 2006, I believe it was, and they did not parent at all, and they just gave him money. They gave him things to substitute for their actual parenting. He lived with the mom. The dad lived in a separate place. He was not around very much, and that's part of the problem that I think made this child feel like he was invincible, and like you could have these parties and drink and take Xanax and then and go driving. I mean, there was no supervision whatsoever. And I see clients like that all the time, but not to this degree. Not with parents that are coming up with an excuse that it's really not it's actually our fault that our child behaved so badly and we just didn't see it coming. I mean, they bear the brunt of the responsibility for which this child clearly had no remorse, and still, until he's 18, he's still showing signs that he can't understand the gravity of the situation and the harm and carnage he caused.
Now, criminal justice professor John Patakis, I wonder what would have happened if this child was not from a wealthy family.
Same thing.
Well, that's that's a good question or whatever. That and perhaps even a different judge, but it may have gotten a more severe sentence. I mean, it's almost,
I would think so.
It's almost mandatory in most states that if you drive under the influence of alcohol or drugs and kill somebody during an accident, it's almost a mandatory prison sentence. So I'm not sure of Texas law, but I'm pretty sure she obviously had that option. And even if she didn't do that, she had a lot of other options, such as intense supervision, electronic monitoring, halfway house. So there's a lot of in-between steps.
Did the judge drop the ball here?
Oh, I think so, definitely. She didn't look at all the alternatives. Now, I would also question, I don't have a lot of facts on that, but what was her relationship with the defense attorney, the parents? They were multimillionaires. In the past, they had paid off victims and others to get out of trouble or whatever. Now, again, you know, did that have any influence? Her relationships with these other people and the psychologists, you know? Because again, when you look at all the factors, a judge knows what you're supposed to look at, and it appears that she didn't put enough reliance on all those other factors that we talked about.
Mike, what message does this send to other kids out there who might be reading the story? Not in a newspaper, but online.
It sends the message that you can get away with anything. And one of the things I want to say to parents out there, and I do a lot of programs around the country where I speak to parents, you have to let kids experience pain and rejection. It's part of the growth process. And a lot of parents are against letting their kid feel rejected. The award for participation, you know, learn to lose and feel that. That's important to success.
I did a story years ago on the streets of New York City, and there was one bratty little kid who demanded to come on television, and we finally had to tell him no. And his face was, I mean, he was in psychotherapy, I'm sure, the next week. He couldn't believe that somebody had finally told him no. Is that a problem, not telling your kids no once in a while?
We have to create a child that's ready to face the world.
True.
And the world says no, doesn't it at times? We have to create a child that can cope. If I fail, it doesn't mean I'm a failure. It means I have to now deal with a learning opportunity. Children who get the message that if they make a mistake, they are a mistake, are going to again develop negative core beliefs. So much of this is predicated on wealth and money, and I don't buy that. I really don't. I facilitate a group, and in my group I have billionaires and I have people that are unemployed, and they're all connected on one thing: they're fragmented. There's an inside of them that when they grew up, they did not again feel important. And what happens is you develop a destructive entitlement when that happens. You actually lose compassion for yourself, therefore you have no compassion for anyone else. And you give yourself permission to act in ways regardless of the harm it causes yourself and others. Now, in this group, I have all different people, but they're all alike underneath. They're fragmented. That common thread.
So it goes back to their childhood.
I'm going to say it again. So we put a lot of emphasis on the money and all of that stuff, but our core beliefs don't develop in our teenhood. They don't develop in our 20s and 30s and 40s. They develop early on in childhood. That's what determines the intimacy we're going to have later on, our parenting skills, the careers we choose.
Curiosity, what ages are most important? Somebody's watching.
I believe between 5 and 10 is very important. All children are egocentric. My son at 5 said, "Dad, what are you going to get me for Father's Day?" Egocentricity.
Scott Palmer, you're an attorney. This is going to be looked at again when Ethan Couch comes back to the United States. How do you see this thing shaking out? Has it garnered enough publicity that there'll be some sort of a verdict, maybe a more harsher verdict?
He's back. He's back to the United States. They had a hearing yesterday in Fort Worth, and the judge held him in custody, in juvenile custody. There's going to be a hearing next week to determine whether or not his case is going to get transferred to adult court. It's all but a certainty that it will. Otherwise, they will lose him in the system, and they will not have him for 10 years. There's no way this new judge, this is a brand new judge who started in January of 2015, it's not going to happen. So the new judge is going to transfer him to adult court, will be put on adult probation, and he'll be looking at different terms and conditions of probation, but he'll be in the adult system where the weight and gravity of the intoxication manslaughter charge that he actually pled to will be on him finally. It wasn't there originally. The juvenile system is capped at what it can do, but they're going to transfer him when he's 19, which is on April 11th, and we will then see whether or not this young man actually wakes up and realizes what is going on here. His lawyers have vowed that he will. Time will tell. I don't know. I mean,
we just have a couple of minutes, and we want to thank you. We're going to wrap it up on your end at least. But last question to you: in this case, will that money make any difference, or the publicity is just too profound?
the money issue is gone. I think at this point he's been under the microscope, and it's the publicity, and everyone's hoping that he fails. Actually, he's been public enemy number one in this area where we live, where I live and practice law. I just can't imagine he has any sympathy from anybody, including this judge. They're all waiting for him to trip up one more time, because all of his, in the future, the probation violations that he has gotten already don't affect his adult probation. It will be from this point forward. If he doesn't mess up, he's got another 8 years to mess up. I don't think it's going to happen. Statistically, it's likely that he'll trip up at some point, but it's up to him to decide whether he wants to live.
Scott Palmer joining us from via Skype. We thank you so much. We appreciate it. Let's get back to you.
Thank you.
If you had 10 minutes with this Ethan Couch, what would you say him as a mental health professional? What would you say to this kid?
Well, I would tell him to take care of his issues and start taking responsibility for them, and to stop blaming others.
Can he do it at this age after living a life like that?
You can do it at any age.
You think so?
You can do it at any age. And you know what? I just want to say this one thing. Everyone needs to work on their issues and look at their history growing up. But this case was a case of exploiting that. And that's the problem here.
Well, you said that Mike says you can change, even as a teenager or older. You're saying once you're fragmented underneath, it's tough to change.
You have to become congruent, which means you have to get to know what's going on the inside of the person. Here's a kid that will not share what's really going on. He's full of self-hate, he's full of shame, he's full of all these things. Healing comes when he brings his insides to the surface and he starts to talk about that. There was a time period that he stopped maturing. You got to go back to what was that time period when he stopped maturing. Was it 5? Was it 6? Was it 7? Go back and talk about what occurred during that time that stopped the process. That's where he started to develop these negative thoughts, these negative stories. That's where it happened. So go back to that point, start to fix that point, that look under those unswept corners of his life. If you want to help him, if the goal is to help him, that's where you have to go, because that's where he stopped growing.
Well, we're going to give John Patakis the last word here. Folks in the criminal justice system must be scratching their head on
well, yeah, I mean, there's always two goals in the criminal justice system. Obviously, public safety, but one is punitive aspect for whatever you've done wrong, but the other part is the rehabilitation part. So I agree with what they're saying about the rehabilitation. He has to want to change or whatever. So whatever sentence comes about after next week, I'm sure therapy and counseling is going to be mandated. He's got to be motivated to do that, and that may happen over a period of time. He's probably going to be on for a while.
And I respectfully disagree with Scott Palmer. I think this is going to come up again somewhere down the road. Well, it might not work, but I think it'll come up again. Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Mr. Palmer, thank you as well from Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, from your Skype hookup. When we come back, growing concern about the Zika virus. We'll be right back.